Thank you again to Nicole and Dino for having me today. When it was suggested to talk about my PhD research, I was super excited because I actually really enjoyed it. And it was all about this concept of psychological empowerment and working with chemistry PhD students who fulfill teaching roles in the undergraduate chemistry lab. So I suppose to give you an idea of the problem space that this kind of project addressed, all chemistry PhD students at UL have to do 6 hours of unpaid lab demonstration duties per week. So it's part of the policy at UL that they just have to do these duties. And it is explicitly stated that, you know, the main purposes, their main responsibilities to maintain safety, kind of set up the apparatus for undergraduate students. But there was no significant incentive or training to engage with students to actually develop students' understanding, to actually ask them questions, to probe for their understanding, to probe, you know, for where they might be helped a little bit to develop their understanding a little bit more. So I was tasked at the start of my PhD to develop a teacher training program for these lab demonstrators. But I quickly kind of hit a bit of a hurdle or a stumbling block because I was actually a first year lab demonstrator myself. So I was put in this weird inferior kind of complex in which I didn't feel comfortable telling, you know, a fourth year lab demonstrator, and there's no ranks because I know in some countries you've senior lab demonstrators and you've just lab demonstrators, but they're all the one in UL in Ireland. So yes, my undergraduate was a teacher education undergraduate, but it was like I never felt comfortable saying, well, this is how you should teach when someone had been doing it for 4 years. So I had to kind of think a little bit outside the box and to find an alternative way to actually catalyze the teaching practices of these PhD students in the chemistry lab. So it was interesting. I was demonstrating in one lab myself. It was a Gen Chem lab. The labs are about 60 students each. And I remember it was a 2-hour lab, this particular lab. It was 2 hours. And it was due to finish at 6 o'clock. And I remember turning around one evening. I was just about to head out the door. And I remember looking back and there was 3 demonstrators still in the lab, and they were hunched over different benches with a little mini crowd of like 3 or 4 students kind of peering over what they were doing. And I was thinking, I was like, there's a lot of important stuff happening and a lot of like important conversations happening there that I think had to be exposed a little bit more for its significance. So I kind of thought to myself, I was like, well, these conversations that these lab demonstrators are having with individual undergraduate students are actually really powerful, because in our Gen Chem lab, or in our Gen Chem course in UL, there's 700-800 students in it. And I was thinking, I was like, well, the opportunities that these students are getting to actually talk to these lab demonstrators are very important, because they don't, in a class of 700-800, they're not going to get a huge amount of time speaking with an expert or the module leader. So that's when I started to realize that if I could get these lab demonstrators to actually perceive their own significance as a teacher in these chemistry labs, I might be onto a winner, because they had to be acknowledged for their expertise, their chemistry expertise, and how important each interaction was with each of these Gen Chem students. So I set off reading, and I came across this construct of psychological empowerment. Now, it was based in the workplace. I think it was in a management journal. I thought it was really interesting. It aligned somewhat to the constructs of teacher empowerment, which is different. This is just almost, a generic psychological empowerment framework, but it comprises of 4 intrinsic motivation cognitions, their impact, competency, autonomy, and meaningfulness. So impact just refers to an individual's belief that they can make a difference. Competency is an individual's belief in their capability to perform activities with skill. Autonomy is an individual's sense of having choice in initiating and regulating actions. And meaningfulness then is the value or the purpose, the importance of a work goal or purpose. So I kind of like was hypothesizing. I was like, I bet that the level or the sense of impact, competency, autonomy, and meaningfulness that these lab demonstrators currently sense is pretty low. And I thought maybe I could set out on a conquest to try and generate the conditions in which they would feel an enhanced sense of psychological empowerment, and that might have an influence on, you know, dialogue between them and students in the lab, but it might actually make them feel a little bit, you know, more important in their role, more empowered. So what happened in the meantime is more fleshed out in these two papers here. So the one on the left, the third paper, details exactly how I went about, you know, using the literature in the areas of empowerment and psychological empowerment to inform I won't say a training program, because it wasn't a training program. It was just a series of workshops that were designed to improve the sense of psychological empowerment experienced by these lab demonstrators. But the paper on the right then just goes through how we kind of track changes in the dialogue that lab demonstrators had with students. But what I'll do is, for the purpose of this talk today, the first part is I'll kind of just give you a quick overview of the level of psychological empowerment that these lab demonstrators were feeling before they did a program. So it was just like a pre-test measure of their sense of psychological empowerment, and that was done using a survey and interviews. So what I found was that it was pretty low. Their sense of psychological empowerment wasn't quite strong. I've just picked out some quotes, more details in the survey, and more quotes can be found in the paper, but the main thing was that they didn't have a sense of impact. They just felt as if they were there to set up the experiments. They weren't dealing with concepts. And that was in part due to the larger culture of the department, that engaging with students for the purpose of developing understanding wasn't championed, it wasn't encouraged. With their sense of competency, I said, do you feel competent as a teacher in these labs? And it was like, no, I don't, because I don't feel we know how to teach. There wasn't any formal training or teacher training for them before this. Their sense of autonomy, they were a bit lost. They didn't know, you know, no one told them that they can or need to teach. So the messages that they got, or the opportunities that they got to actually be autonomous in their roles, were few and far between. And with their sense of meaningfulness, it was just something that they had to do. They didn't see any value in it. It wasn't important to them. If anything, it was just something that was just interfering with their research. So they were getting nothing out of it. So I designed this program. I'm still having difficulty with how you refer to it exactly, but it was to try and set out to reverse this trend of psychological empowerment. I was like, okay, well, what do we need to do to kind of boost how they're feeling about their roles and their responsibilities? So I had this program that I set up for them, and I called it the Teaching as a Chemistry Laboratory Graduate Teaching Assistant Program. So the first thing I did was I was like, I said to the department, before they had high-vis jackets, so the lab demonstrators wore high-vis jackets with lab demonstrator on the back. And I was like, well, the first thing that we need to do if we want these guys to actually teach is to call them, graduate teaching assistants, which they are more commonly referred to in places like the US. But lab demonstrators more common in Ireland, the UK, and Australia. So what exactly did I do? So I had an opening seminar, and I presented them really quickly, and pretty like no fluff around the edges. But I just said, okay, there was three aims of the opening seminar. The first was to kind of almost set a problem for them. I'm like, okay, this is the chemistry triplet. So your macroscopic, your submicroscopic, and this is the 3 levels of understanding in chemistry. And I was like, I show them the evidence that we have or the papers that we have in chemistry education and science education that suggest that lab work, we're still having difficulty trying to evidence its advancements to fostering the development of conceptual understanding. So I was like, well, are there ways in which we can work together to try and help students just translate what they see into the conceptual ideas? And then I also presented them Kelly Galloway and Stacey's work on meaningful learning. I was like, okay, well, here we're conceptualizing, what meaningful learning is in terms of, the affective, the cognitive, and the psychomotor domains of learning, and how they all need to be addressed, and if learning is to be meaningful. And I was specifically kind of encouraging them to consider the affective learning, because I believe that the affective learning domain is quite powerful. And then I also presented them literature on the importance of graduate students. There's some papers that suggest that, or that evidence that graduate teaching assistants are really important, and they do have a significant impact on learning in the lab. So I was like, you guys are really important, and if we are to address this problem and to foster or create more meaningful learning environments for students in the chemistry lab, you guys are, primarily situated and suited to actually really achieve something special here for students. And what I was really trying to do was, in order to improve their sense of impact, competency, autonomy, and meaningfulness, there's this structure, this 3 kind of tripodic structure that's been shown in general teacher education to have a positive influence on student learning. It's the establishment of professional teaching community in which teaching is discussed amongst professionals that have a collective responsibility for the improvement of teaching and learning. But also you've got authentic pedagogy, which is kind of responding to instances in which if a question needs to be asked, we need to ask it, or if there's an explanation that is given or that needs to be given or that could be given, well, what we're going to do about it. So I was like, this is what we're going to try and set out to achieve. So this is what I used in the workshops. I had 4 workshops after the opening seminar, and the workshops basically consisted of me saying, okay, there's this Gen Chem lab coming up, be it a titration, let's say one of them was a titration lab, and all that consisted of the workshop was me asking these lab demonstrators, GTAs, graduate teaching assistants, asking these 6 questions that were kind of underpinned by meaningful learning. So for, take for instance the psychomotor domain, I was like, well, what do you think, what lab skills do you think students have before this lab session? And what lab skills do you think that students should develop? And we had a discussion, and they were coming up with ideas, and they were saying, oh, I've done this lab for 2 or 3 years, and I see that they're not able to do this properly at the end of it. And I was like, okay, well, that's a good point. And with the cognitive domain, we discussed the same thing, but I was like, what do you think students will know about what they see during this lab, and what do you think that they should be able to understand? particularly at sub-micro level, after this lab. So if there's a colour change, well, why was there a colour change? So we spoke about that, and they came up with really good ideas. And I was kind of encouraging to see that, for meaningful learning to happen, it's that taking about what's already known and building upon it, so that you take the prior knowledge and you construct it in a meaningful way. But what encapsulates that is the effective domain. Because I said, well, how do you think students will feel about this lab session? And how do you think they could feel? So that was helping them, I guess, to frame meaningful learning, but also kind of asking them and getting them to make decisions as features of the empowerment process. So I recorded them at 3 stages. So once, as in I recorded them by putting little dictaphones in the lab jackets of each lab demonstrator. And I analysed all the lab dialogue that happened between individual lab demonstrators and students at 3 stages, before, during, and after the programme. And there were so many different types of verbal interactions, different cognitive questions, cognitive explanations, practical instructions, procedural questions, and more detailed explanations or descriptions of each of these verbal interactions are in the JCE paper that I referred to just before this. And what that paper sets out, and what we noticed, was that there was a huge amount of increase in the verbal interaction that the GTAs were engaging in, from before as lab demonstrators to after as GTAs. So the number of questions went from, in total, now the 7 lab demonstrators in the first recording, 210 different questions asked, but by the end of it, that had increased to 662. The number of questions that students asked went from 270 in the first recording to 789 by the end of it. So it that suggests that perhaps students were feeling that they were a little bit more comfortable, that something was substantiating between the students and the lab demonstrators, because the lab demonstrators because they thought about it and they discussed learning and meaningful learning about the lab beforehand. They were going in there with a mission. They were like, I'm gonna make sure that students know the difference between heat and temperature in this lab, and they were empowered, and they were going in there with an agenda, with a mission, which was nice to see. So what influence did it have on lab demonstrators or GTA's sense of psychological empowerment? Again, we re-administered the survey, which, yes, has limitations. But we did the interviews again, and there was a significant increase in the sense of psychological empowerment experienced by these demonstrators. That they were saying the undergraduate students were much more motivated. They could see those who weren't interested once upon a time actually changing their view in their lab. So the sense of impact from this quote in this GTA was saying that they could see that their behaviour from engaging with students a lot more was actually making it a more positive learning experience for the students. Sense of competency. Before, according to this GTA, I didn't know exactly how to deal with students, but now they felt as if they were a little bit more competent, they were a little bit more capable to engage with a student for the purpose of improving their, lab experience. And they did say that they were shy and they didn't think as if they felt they had the knowledge, but actually me saying, well, you know what, you actually do have a lot of knowledge, and you are actually very capable of engaging in such a conversation. They felt a little bit more encouraged. Autonomy, they actually felt beforehand, and this was probably more evocative of, the culture at the time, was that as lab demonstrators, they thought that they couldn't decide what to do, and their main purpose was to just go and teach them how to use the different instrumentations or apparatus. But this first quote here from this GTA was saying, you know, now they're actually going out of the way to ask a student if something isn't working, well, why isn't it working? And start a conversation from there. The sense of meaningfulness, this is probably my favorite part, because from this quote, it says, to be of value, it means that I should have the ability to make change in someone else. And what was really interesting, because throughout all the pre-program interviews, when I asked them about sense of meaningfulness, they were saying no, because it's disturbing my research. I can't do what I want to do, and I've got a million other things that I want to be doing. It doesn't really help me. It was much more focused on them. And then when you ask them afterwards, they developed a sense of meaningfulness because they saw what they were doing, their behaviors and their actions was actually improving students' learning experience. So the fact that they could see they're having an impact on someone else, that's when it became meaningful, not when it was focused on how the role wasn't contributing to their own research. So there are some limitations to the work. Empowerment doesn't always have to come with an increase in power. I didn't change the structure. I didn't change, you know, the lab teaching and learning approaches didn't change. It was just these you know, a group of chemistry PhD students coming together and saying, okay, well, listen, how can we improve things? You can't decide to inject power into someone. All you can do is generate a condition for someone else to feel an enhanced sense of empowerment, and that's different. Throughout the analysis of the lab transcripts, and the way I went about analysing them by separate like interactions in terms of explanations or questions, whatever, I could see towards the end that I was missing really constructivist moments, whereas before a lab demonstrator and a student might have only interacted for, I think the average was about 7 seconds post program, but by the end of it, it was averaging 31 seconds. And that was 30 seconds of, you know, what do you know? And let's try and build. So that was pretty nice. The increase in verbal reactions could have also just been because they got to know each other a little bit better. They became more familiar with each other. There's more positive relationships. But I'd still take that as a win, even if it wasn't as a direct consequence of the program. Participation in this program was voluntary. When you do that, it also, you know, these people were, from the get-go, they were motivated in some way to kind of improve. If they volunteered themselves for a teacher education program or a teacher training program or whatever, they were always going to be a little bit more encouraged to make a difference. So that makes replication studies of things like this very difficult, because this research was a story that happened in the University of Limerick with chemistry PhD students at that time. So it is difficult to replicate it, but that's the beauty of it. I think it's there for people to probably take some sort of meaning for themselves and integrate it in some way into their own, you know, departments or training programs. But the implications for practice, and I'm nearly finished. I just have 1 or 2 more slides. Just simply calling them graduate teaching assistants meant a lot, as opposed to calling them lab demonstrators, because as lab demonstrators, they thought their job was to demonstrate physically, and that's what they were doing, and not rigorously or like engaging in sophisticated dialogic discussions with exchanges with students. Acknowledging and acting upon the significance of each single verbal interaction that these people have with individual undergraduate students, it was very important in catalyzing their teaching practices. They need to know how important they are. Praising them, giving them problems, encouraging them to try and troubleshoot it, consulting with them, you know, actually saying, well, what do you think? Because they've spent 4 years in these labs with students. They have a hell of a lot of expertise and understanding, and giving them a chance, because in teacher education literature, it's like, well, how do you empower teachers? Well, you give them more decisions at, school boards, or decision making is huge in an empowerment process. And things become meaningful for people when they recognize their influence on others. So for other lab demonstrator GTA training programs, if the messages gets across that what they do and what their responsibilities, it may help for them to develop an enhanced sense of meaningfulness if they see the difference that they can make. So last slide, the implications for research then. Chemistry education research is only really beginning to consider how we can improve, change, or influence emotions or mindsets. There's been fantastic work up until now developing instruments that we can use to measure emotions, measure feelings. But we know very little about how we can actually influence it. And that's not specific to chemistry education. That was actually in the How People Learn To report in America that was released there two years ago, I think. So we need to know more about the inner mechanisms of influencing emotions. We need to know more about the influence we have on students and the influence that they have on us, because while we all, in chemistry education, we all have an influence in research circles, and through our publications, through our talks and everything. That's all fantastic. But I've known a lot of people in chemistry education. I've known a lot of professors, postdocs, PhD students who have such powerful influences in their own classrooms and with their own students that I feel I'd love to know more about and love to learn more about as well as the research on chemistry teaching and learning on a broader scale. And researching, reflecting on cultures, classroom cultures, is something that I think that we could learn a little bit more from each other on. So that's all. Thank you so much, Nicole and Dino, for your patience when my internet decided to have one of those days. I know it's been a long year for everyone, and I think my internet has had a long year too. But thank you very much, Nicole, and thank you for Dino and Maria. Apologies again. And yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Aisling. And you sparked a lot of discussion in the chat, and it's going back and forth. There hasn't been that many questions with regard to your talk, but I mean, as you can see, and maybe you can go over the chat right now and see how the discussion's going back and forth. So thank you very much for sharing your topic. I think there was one question that Michael was asking somewhere in between that I want to share. He was asking if you could distill headlines, you could empower demonstrators in introductory training sessions, what would you choose? If you have a...
Sorry, what was that question?
If you could distill headlines, we could empower demonstrators in introductory training sessions, what would you choose? Kind of when you would have to choose, what would you concentrate on? When training graduate teaching assistants? I mean, we can ask the question to Julia as well, and maybe her answer would be different. But
I think how because one of the things that I really struggled with at the beginning was having a teacher training program, and I felt that that terminology was wrong, because it wasn't wrong, but it was wrong for me, because I felt as if these people, first of all, they don't realize themselves as teachers, and second of all, training involved me actually telling them apparently the best ways to go about these teaching lessons. So I think kind of coming at it in a different way, really emphasizing the empowerment thing, I think that was one of the headlines that I'd probably recommend or advise.
Good. Thank you.